Greetings, fellow humans. I know I just did a book haul last month, but I've completely lost control of my life. I was on a self-inflicted book buying ban for a couple months now, and so now that I'm finally let myself buy books again, I just wanted to go absolutely nuts, and part of it was in celebration of physically being at Space Cowboy Books. At the start of this month, I took a trip with my girlfriend to Joshua Tree, California in the high deserts. This was my second time visiting Joshua Tree. And on my first visit, I stumbled upon Space Cowboy Books. I wasn't looking for a bookstore at the time. I just remember being in Sun Alley shops, and I saw a sign that similar to this logo that just said Space Cowboy on it, and I was just like, I don't know what that is, but I want to find out. And as soon as I walked into the alleyway and saw the storefront, I was like, oh my god, it's a bookstore. This is the best thing I could have found. Not only that, it is a bookstore that specializes in science fiction. Well, I know I'm not the only sci-fi fan out there. I feel like science fiction is often overlooked. I know at my local library, the sci-fi section is condensed to one bookshelf, and it's not a particularly small library either. There's also been bookstores I've gone to that won't even carry science fiction. So to find a store that completely specialized in it was really exciting. Space Cowboy Books is also just more than a bookstore, and they do a handful of really neat things. For one, they give away free books to children under, I think it's age 14. They host lots of awesome live events between book release parties and reads. And they also produce a science fiction anthology podcast called Simultaneous Times. So besides being the only bookstore in Joshua Tree, California, they're just an absolute treasure. And so just more than anything, I wanted to be able to go back to this bookstore in person. So being able to go there in person on my trip was really something that meant a lot to me. So this first book I was actually waiting on until I received before filming this video because I really wanted to start with it. Simultaneous Times Volume 2. This book is published by Space Cowboy Books, and it is a companion piece to their science fiction anthology podcast. Some of the stories that appeared in the print have already appeared in the podcast, others are new ones. The reason why I wanted to start with this is because on my first trip to Space Cowboy Books, I bought the first anthology. I was really just looking for something I couldn't find anywhere else, and because it was a book specifically published by that bookstore and also all involved authors local to Joshua Tree, it was just the best pick for me to come home with, and I really enjoyed the first one, but I also knew the podcast has grown so much since the release of the first one that I was really looking forward to Volume 2. In fact, once I knew that this book was coming out this year, I would periodically message Space Cowboy Books and be like, hey, when's the anthology coming out? Because I was just really looking forward to it. And I'm excited to have it now. Looking at the list of contributors, I'm really excited to say that I am familiar with every single contributor on the list, which how often can you say that about an anthology? I've been listening to the podcast for 2 years now, I think. And so I am just familiar with the contributors and what kind of style of stories they write, and one of the coolest thing about the anthology and the podcast is just the variety of takes on science fiction. We've got writers like Brent A. Harris, who writes mostly alternate universe, and then there's Susan Rukeyser, who takes a more feminist dystopian take on science fiction. And also, like, writers like John Christopher, who writes these really bizarre, whimsical stories. Like, my favorite of his from the podcast is a story about an alien wizard who has the ability to be reincarnated. He comes to Earth, and upon arriving, he has a Reuben sandwich, and it is, like, the best thing he's ever eaten, and then he spends like the rest of his lives trying to find another Reuben sandwich that measures up to the first one he had, which is just like, how do you think of that? And it was awesome. The book is also like wonderfully illustrated. Like, look at that, so cool. I'm really looking forward to digging into this one because it's something I've been waiting on since I got my hands on the first anthology. And that one I had to actually order online because it wasn't coming out until like a week after I was in Joshua Tree. But now I'm gonna start to dig into the books I actually got in store. Gather the Children by Mary Collier. She is a local Joshua Tree writer and appeared in the anthology I just mentioned. Besides her short stories, I really haven't read her work, which is kind of a shame because every time I see a synopsis of one of her books, I am like, that idea is genius and I really want to read it, but for some reason I hadn't gotten around to it. This book is a hybrid between alien sci-fi and the Old West, which is a combination I am totally here for. I did find out that this is actually part of a series, and it's actually book 2 in the series. I don't think they need to be read in order though, at least I'm hoping not. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. I don't actually remember why I put this on my TBR list, like, it's just been on there for such a long time. However, I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts like a couple days ago, and I mention it now because I'm gonna mention it a lot in this video, and I've mentioned it in the past too. It's called Our Opinions Are Correct, and it's hosted by authors Charlie Jane Anders and Analee Newitz. They talk about various science fiction and fantasy concepts, kind of dissecting them, as well as citing different books, movies, TV shows that have explored these various concepts, and I always end up leaving with a new book recommendation. So this book was actually mentioned in one of the more recent episodes I listened to, and the topic they were discussing was hive minds, which is something I want to explore in my writing sometime. So this has kind of been booted to the top of the list of books to read because I want to get a feel of how other people have handled this topic. The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. And after reviewing The Left Hand of Darkness in one of my previous booktube videos, this book was recommended to me, and I don't remember if this is part of the same series as The Left Hand of Darkness, but because it was spoken so highly of and I really liked what she did in Left Hand of Darkness, I wanted to try this one too. Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. So this one, I don't remember if it was a booktuber that I was watching, I don't remember who it was, and if I ever figure out the video I'm about to mention, I will link it because it was such a good video. But anyway, I was watching this video essay which explored how the Hunger Games sparked this trend of young adult dystopian novels, which is something that was going on when I was a teenager. And also, I genuinely really like The Hunger Games too, and I think it's a good series. But anyway, so it was about how Hunger Games kind of started that trend and how Divergent was the end of young adult dystopian novels because it took what Hunger Games had and just like boiled it down to like the bare essentials and kind of unintentionally parodied what it was that worked for Hunger Games. It just like put an end to that trend where it was just like there's nothing else that can be said about this within the genre of young adult, and I'm describing the video really poorly, but it was just so well done and so enthralling, and for some reason at the very end they gave a book recommendation, which was Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, and I was just so impressed by the video. I was like, okay, I'm gonna add this to my TBR because obviously this person knows what they're doing. However, this book is about a plague, so I don't know if I'm going to be reading it anytime soon because that do hit a little close to home right now. Orlando by Virginia Woolf. This one was a favorite book of one of my booktube buddies. Jessica from Lady Loves Dead Read mentioned it in her favorite books ever video. So not only because I'm friends with Jessica that I wanted to read this, but also the description of the book really compelled me. It is one of the earliest depictions of a transgender character in fiction, as well as the writing is just apparently very good, so I wanted to check it out because of that. Mutants by Armand Marie Leroy. So this is the only book I bought that wasn't on my TBR. The subtitle is On Genetic Variety and the Human Body. I believe it is a nonfiction read, and obviously talking about, as what it says, genetic variety in the human body. So it's kind of just like a morbid curiosity read for me. I'm really into studying biology just for funsies, and so I figured this would be a good read for that. The Female Man by Joanna Russ. This is another book that's been on my TBR for so long that I kind of forgot why I put it on there in the first place. And no one's got some fun gender play going on, which I'm always really interested in, especially for older works of fiction where that wasn't really the norm of the time. Whereas I think we're a little bit more open-minded about that these days. Even so, these older works are like so incredibly forward for their time. It's really awesome. That's why I love exploring them. Wendy Darlin by A.C. Wise. So, to be honest, I'm not really into this trend of retellings. Part of it might just be that, like, in order to be into retellings, you have to have some sort of like nostalgic connection to the stories being retold, and most of them are like fairy tales, and I wasn't ever really into fairy tales that much to begin with. Even like the classic Disney movies, I've seen them, I saw them when I was younger, and I was kind of just like, I didn't get it back then. I certainly don't get it now. So honestly, this is something I wouldn't normally go for. It's a kind of retelling slash sequel to Peter Pan, but a couple things about it stood out to me. As a child, I was really into the portal fantasy type of stories, but was always disappointed when at the end of the story, the main character returned to the normal world. So in this book, Wendy is an adult, and it kind of explores how she has adapted back to the real world after having lived in this fantasy world. The other part that really intrigued me is kind of the feminist take on Peter Pan. Rather than being this appealing boy that never grows old, it's the man who refuses to grow up. Which that phase in particular really strikes me, and I look forward to seeing how she explores that in the book. So the next 3 books I ordered off of Space Cowboy's bookshop rather than in store, because I had to order the anthology that way, and I always just like to throw a couple more books in my cart. The first being the Binti trilogy by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a series of 3 novellas all compiled into one, and I actually wanted this for a while, but they were sold out of this one online, and instead I think they only had just the first one. And I was like, well, I definitely want all 3 of them. If I'm going to read it, I'm going to commit. This one's an Afro-punk science fiction, which I haven't read. I don't think I've read any so far, so I'm looking forward to exploring a different subgenre in science fiction. I got Autonomous by Analee Newitz, who is one of the hosts of the podcast I mentioned earlier, Our Opinions Are Correct. And they discussed it a little bit in, I don't remember what the episode's theme was, but they talked about a scene where they're where their android main character is confused at homophobia that he experienced. And you know I'm always looking for like queer sci-fi to read, so it's kind of weird that I haven't read anything by Analee Newitz, despite the fact that I listen to their podcast pretty religiously at this point. Infomocracy by Malka. This book is also thanks to Analee Newitz. It wasn't Our Opinions Are Correct, but it was a different podcast that Analee started, which I can't remember the name of, and I always struggle to find it on iTunes anyway. But in it, they talk to Malka and discussing the future of democracy and voting, particularly in a future where we're all kind of spread around the planet. And the episode of the podcast kind of discussed the ideas that were included in this book, and after listening to the podcast episode, I was like, I'm definitely hungry for more, so I really wanted the book. And that's it for books I got from Space Cowboy, but I do got a couple other books that I did get while in the high desert. Feckless Cunt, edited by Susan Rukeyser, who I mentioned before. She wrote for Simultaneous Times anthology. This is a feminist anthology. I think it was when Trump was first elected, she was really inspired to speak up. She started her own press called World Split Open Press, and all of her publications are just like these really awesome feminist point of views and perspectives, and everything she's released has been amazing. I'm not as familiar with this list of contributors, except for like Bonnie Brady, who I read her abortion memoir, also published from World Split Open Press, called And That Was That, which I also highly recommend you checking out. And I don't have it with me currently, but I also got A Fly on Stonewall, which is a chapbook / zine, I use the two words very interchangeably, about the Stonewall riots, written from the perspective of a fly on Stonewall. I think Feckless Cunt you can purchase on Bookshop, but you can also buy it directly from Susan's Etsy shop, which I will be linking below, as well as A Fly on Stonewall. And the next two books I got in Yucca Valley at a comic book / record store called Hoodoo. Paper Girls, which I don't know too much about it, but my girlfriend recommended it to me. I think it's about time travel, and I think it's probably gay too. The last part I'm wildly speculating about. And Bitch Planet, which I've never heard about before. I don't know anything about it, but I saw it and I was like, I gotta have this. I don't know if this is a science fiction or not, but it does look very punk rock and feminist and possibly gay, so that's all the books I got while I was visiting in the high desert in Joshua Tree, California. I'm going to link the bookshop for Space Cowboy books in particular for this video, for anyone who wishes to support them. They're a really awesome shop. They're the only bookstore in Joshua Tree, California. They do lots of awesome things, and I want to see them thrive. So thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll see you next time.